We will talk briefly, since we don't have so much time, about the actual paper that looks at ways of influencing Security Council decision-making with specific reference to Australia. We look in the first part of the paper at instances where Australia was not an elected member on the Council, but nevertheless exerted significant influence in particular crisis settings. And I would like to focus in particular on East Timor. Then, secondly, Jeremy will talk briefly about Australia's experience on the Council, so basically refer to the most recent experience of Australia's non-permanent membership on the Council. But we will start now with a brief introduction of our new project. So, Jeremy, please.
The title of the project, as you see, is Leveraging Power and Influence on the UN Security Council, the Role of Elected Members. Now, it's a 4-year project, and we are just at the very beginning of it, the opening stages. So what we're sharing today is some initial findings from the project, but there's a lot to be found out down the track. The project team includes both of us and Chris Mickelson from UNSW, the law school there, and Dr. Jenny Whalen, also from UNSW. So perhaps... the project has 5 aims. The first aim is to provide an empirically grounded evaluation of when elected members have influenced the Council's decision-making. The second aim is to advance knowledge about instances of elected member influence, including by developing a conceptual framework to understand and measure how elected members build, exercise and maintain influence on the Council. The third aim is to develop a theory of elected member influence. The fourth, to advance pragmatic, evidence-based policy proposals designed to increase the capacity of elected members to exercise power and influence over UN Security Council decision-making and norm development in future. And the final role is to identify the role that Australia and other actors can play both here in our region but also globally in promoting these proposals. We have a series of outcomes, perhaps, Jochen, if you could go to the next one. A series of outcomes that we're working to produce, the first of which is a mapping project, which charts instances in which elected members have had a demonstrable influence over Security Council decision-making, and that's in the post-Cold War era, so we begin our search in 1990. Second sort of category of outcomes is a series of working papers harnessing the best scholarly and practitioner analysis of the experiences of non-permanent members in building, exercising and maintaining power on the Council. The third is the policy proposals, a major report which synthesises proposals which are aimed at increasing the capacity of elected members to exercise power and influence. And the fourth, of course, is the typical sort of academic outputs, a couple of books and a series of journal articles. So that's a brief summary of our project. The first phase of the project, which is the mapping phase, is what we're beginning at the moment. And of course, there's no place better for us to begin that mapping than with Australia's experience. So we look forward to getting to know those of you in the room who contributed to Australia's contributions to the Council very well. We'll be knocking on your doors and seeking to understand as much as we can about Australia's time on the Council. In the time we have remaining, we'll share, as Jochen said, some thoughts about how Australia has been able to influence Council decision-making, both prior to being on the Council and then on the Council. So back to you, Jochen.
Thank you very much indeed. So let's move to the paper. I'm very glad that we had Peter Varghese' introduction and indeed, Michael, your question on multilateralism under pressure, because this sets the scene very, very well when we look at the current situation or condition of the UN Security Council. Because what we see at the moment, it's still, in essence, a post-World War II creation that hasn't changed. But so far, we haven't seen any serious efforts to entirely abandon the UN Security Council. So it's still in place. But since we've seen power shifts and we're currently facing a transition of order, well, how can it then be that this dinosaur, if you want, can still prevail? And my previous work, which directly feeds into this project, has looked at the role of informal institutions influencing Security Council decision-making. So basically groups of friends, contact groups, core groups that basically assemble potentially non-members of the UN Security Council, which then directly influence Security Council decision-making without being members on the Council. So what I've done in my previous work, which is the first part of the paper, to look at, well, the period when the Security Council came pretty much under stress, the 1990s, when there were more and more complex crises and conflicts on the agenda of the Council. So what you have seen then in this period, you have seen a proliferation of informal institutions working in and around the Council. For Australia, of particular significance was Cambodia in 1990, 1991, and also then East Timor in 1999. And those institutions pretty much then gathered, usually outside the Council, but then influenced Security Council decision-making through their work. So that's basically one way. If you're not a member on the Council, then you can use those informal institutions to basically exercise influence. And Australia did that pretty well in 1999 through the core group on East Timor, which we elaborate on, focus on in the first part of the paper. Because at that stage, East Timor obviously was a pretty relevant crisis, important crisis, where Australia wanted to have voice and influence in the management. But at the same time, it wasn't at that stage elected member on the Council. But how did Australia manage to do that? In a way, what we try in this project and in this paper to get away from the idea that all Security Council activity revolves around the P5. So basically, 5 to rule them all. That's the title of Regent book. So what we want to see and to highlight is how Security Council decision-making is very often decentered and disaggregated, happening in those informal institutions where very much of Security Council language and reaction is prepared and pre-cooked. So that's very important to see. And I think from an Australian perspective, that worked particularly well in 1999 and thereafter through the core group on East Timor. Unfortunately, I won't have time to elaborate on that in great detail, but once the paper is out, have a look and read through it. And I think I will now immediately hand over to Jeremy, who will then look at those instances when Australia was indeed an elected member on the Council and look at the differences. In the conclusions, we will then highlight the implications of that, to what extent it's actually valuable or not so valuable to actually serve on the Council.
Okay, great. Well, yes, as Jochen has mentioned, a lot of the detail for both of our parts of the comments today will be it is in the written paper. And of course, there are so many instances that you could choose to look at in terms of trying to evaluate where and how Australia had particular influence over Council decision-making. For the purposes of the paper and today, I'm going to refer to two instances that are related in that they both involved pursuing action against the obstruction of a particular permanent member. The first case was the case of the downing of MH17, Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, of course causing the deaths of 298 people, including 38 Australian nationals or residents. Now, in that case, Australia immediately started pushing for a resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire surrounding the crash site and a comprehensive international investigation leading to a process that would hold accountable those responsible for the downing of MH17. And Australia pursued this objective with strong determination, despite the reluctance of others to take the lead on a resolution, including some permanent members, and of course the even stronger reluctance of Russia to accept such a draft resolution. Australia's Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, flew to New York to help build momentum for the draft resolution. And as a result of Australia's hard work, Security Council Resolution 2166 was adopted just 4 days after the crash on Monday, 21st of July. Now, given the hesitation of some other council members to pursue urgent action on MH17, it's not an exaggeration to state that Resolution 2166 would not have been adopted if it had not been for Australia's strong motivation, determination and leadership. The second case is one of unfinished business, and that is the pursuit of a resolution on sanctions implementation. And Australia, of course, had a strong interest in sanctions implementation, which came out of the wheat for weapons scandal connected with the oil for food program in Iraq, where we were decidedly embarrassed by the activities of the Australian Wheat Board in paying more than $200 million in terms of kickbacks as part of the scheme. And Australia, after that, and DFAT in particular, played a very strong role in creating a legislative structure which would ensure that there wouldn't be such an instance again. So it's not a surprise when you consider that Australia would pursue an initiative on sanctions implementation on the Council. Australia sponsored a high-level review process on sanctions with four other states, Finland, Germany, Greece and Sweden, and then it drew on that process to launch discussions around a draft resolution which sought to harmonise elements of sanctions implementation. Now, ultimately, Australia couldn't convince Russia to accept its preferred draft, and Russia was demanding so many concessions that the text would have been virtually unrecognisable. So Australia was forced to withdraw that resolution, draft resolution. In our written paper, thanks. In our written paper, we'll examine closely some of the reasons why it was possible to achieve success in the first case, but not in the second. But let's just consider some brief potential key factors here. Obviously, in MH17, there was the horror of the moment, and there was also the high-level engagement. As mentioned, the Foreign Minister flew to New York and helped drive momentum towards the resolution. In terms of sanctions, the timing is a key factor that you would argue is quite a negative one, in that the politics of sanctions were very high at that time, and particularly for Russia, because the European Union, the US and Australia all had different forms of sanctions imposed against key Russian policymakers as a result of the crises in Crimea and the eastern Ukraine. So you'd have to question how strong the Russian appetite was to support any level of initiative on sanctions at that time. Perhaps back to you, Jochen, to make some closing comments.
1.5 minutes. Well, what we tried to do in this paper is basically to juxtapose the two scenarios, one in which Australia was elected member on the Council and another one in which it wasn't, which then leads to a very crucial question. Is it strictly necessary to be on the UN Security Council if you want to make a difference in world politics? Or is it good enough to use issue-based coalitions to achieve that? I close here, and I leave the answer to the question to Michael.